Welcome to our next session, which is called The Evolving Data Landscape and the Need for Data Standards. It goes without saying that data is at the heart of everything we all do currently. And we've got a fabulous panel here today to help us navigate what is probably a pretty complex and challenging landscape. But before we dive in and before we go into the detail, just a couple of housekeeping points, if I may. First of all, can I remind everyone of the fixed trading community press policy? We're conducting the event under the Chatham House rule. So please, if you do plan to quote anyone, you must ask their permission first. We'll be taking questions at the end to the panel. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box with Zoom or raise your hand to ask a question to the panel directly. Just it's over on the right-hand side. If you raise your hand, then I can get in touch with you that way. Finally, can I please encourage you all at the end of this session to join the other panel sessions and visit the different areas in the virtual conference centre, which I say looks pretty impressive. So give that a go as well. So you'll see our wonderful panelists gradually emerging, and I'll make the introductions now. First of all, and really needs no real introduction, we've got Kaye, who is co-chair of the Consolidated Tape Data Standards Equities working group here at FIX. We've got Richard Young, who's the co-chair of the Reference Data Standards working group at FIX and responsible for industry relations at Bloomberg. Really pleased to have Geoffroy Vander Linden, who is the co-chair of the Reference Data Standards working group at FIX, and he's country head at MarketAxess in the Netherlands. Finally, last but not least, by any means least, Alex Wolcough, who is director of GreenBirch Group Limited. And finally, my name is James Cooper. I'm the buy-side representative here, and I work as a program manager at Horizon Asset. So the topic area is pretty vast. So I think we decided we'd try and focus our attention on reference data rather than too much on market data, but I'm sure there's going to be some overlap there. But essentially, we're going to be looking at, amongst other things, but most importantly, why standards are so important in the work that we do. So if I may, and thank you all for joining us. We've got a great audience here today. Thank you all for taking the time. I'll start off with Geoffroy. Over to you. How have the data challenges increased, would you say, Geoffroy, since the implementation of MiFID?
Hi, hello everyone, and I'm very excited to be part of this panel, and it's actually my first virtual panel. So thanks James for the question. So indeed it's a very vast topic. So I'm not going to take too much risk by saying that the data challenges have increased across the board and within many areas across the industry further to MiFID. And I'm just going to cover a few challenges. The first one, it's a European regulation with a European approach, while most of us operate in a global environment. So, and MiFID had far-reaching impact. We're going to develop that further in the panel, but definitely that's definitely one of the key challenges that we had to face. An example, from a trading platform viewpoint, each time we list a bond on the platform, we need to have an LEI from the issuer. And obviously, if you list some, let's say Asian issuers on the platform, then they don't have a requirement to have an LEI. So it was quite a challenge for us to have that information initially, at least. Another challenge was the process of the reporting. Again, as a venue and SIs, we all have to report reference data, but only one, was considered to be, let's say, the primary source of the information. So while we all had to report, similar bonds, for instance, if I take an example as a bond. But if, the data was erroneous, from the primary, venue, then we had to obviously deal with some reconciliation issues, communicate with ESMA on these issues. We had a lot of warning messages, so that's definitely was definitely a major challenge to have a process which was quite complex. Then as an industry, we'll have to rely on first database, obviously consume the data, and definitely that's where we had also a lot of challenges like classification of asset classes. The database T+1 was some of the requirement are T, happening also in real time. So that's another challenge. And then obviously I guess some standard were being used, but it created also a problem to have certain standard being used, but maybe lack of harmonization for certain parts. So then maybe quickly just to say how we did to contract these challenges, if I may. So the first one is we work together very well, as an industry through association. I must say again, from a venue viewpoint, we worked in the past together, but not as extensively as we did with MiFID II. And to be fair, now we are working a lot together on many different topics. So I must say, if put us all together. Also, we had to obviously run a lot of iterative process with ESMA and get a lot of feedback and send our feedback to them to try to deal with these challenges. And then finally, we had to put a lot of money into it. I can speak for ourselves, but we had to set up a reg data team, and we're still obviously having this team in place. Looking at checking the quality of the data, reconciling the data. So overall, it was definitely an increase in terms of the cost to deal with these challenges, and it's still an ongoing cost.
And maybe to both of you, but Richard, let's jump over to you. What are the main areas that the reference data working group has been focused on?
Well, obviously, just to actually continue a little bit from the theme from Geoffroy, I mean, we've seen that MiFID particularly has been massively data intensive. It's not the only one. I mean, EMEA is also a challenge too. And of course, we've got some changes to both of those coming through, and we'll come back to that. I think one of the things that's been a feature study of MiFID II has been the way that regulators have been more prescriptive in terms of the way they want data presented. So we're used to supplying data to regulators over many years now, but now increasingly the format and the identifiers, the way the data is presented is very much buttoned down by the regulator, and that's the way they demand to see it. So that obviously has produced quite a number of challenges, because it's meant that people have been maybe using standards they haven't used before, or if they have used them, they're using them in a different way. But many are getting familiar with 20022 as a financial messaging standard for transaction reporting and other reporting. They're getting used to classifiers, as Geoffroy mentioned, like CFI codes, and all these sorts of things are not necessarily familiar, and the way that they've been prescribed by the regulator has certainly had challenges to it. So we've been focusing on the regulatory group or the reference data group, I should say, on the some of those identifiers, some of those prescriptive methodologies that the regulators have put in place to help people navigate that. We've also got new sources of data that weren't there before, like Geoffroy mentioned, the third system, which is the reference data that is collected under MiFID II and then is held in that repository and then needs to be used by the industry for their reporting. We've got the other F, the FITTers system, which is where the liquidity status, thresholds for transparency, waivers and deferrals, all of that is driven out of that system, so people have to learn to navigate that. And so we've basically been trying to sort of put together, and we'll come back to it a bit more later, a paper which actually helps people to navigate some of these data sources, the key standards that are relevant for the key pieces of regulation, particularly MiFID II, and that paper, hopefully, which is I think being distributed with this conference, will contribute to a better understanding of this. We're also trying to make sure that where there are ongoing consultations, and there's one recently with the EMEA refit, that we are responding to that as part of the fixed community, to make sure that where standards and data are evolving as the regulation evolves, that the right choices are being made and the industry's voice is being heard.
That's vital. And you gave a long list of different standards, and with so many standards, how does the industry work globally to ensure that data is harmonized? And I want to bring in the others as much as I can. Alex, do you want to chip in with your thoughts on that, please?
Yes. So it was interesting when we saw MiFID II come along, how we saw a whole bundle of new data needs, but not much direction on the data standards. And, there was a lot of work that needed to be done, but just as we had new regulation coming in, I felt from a personal perspective, looking at the industry, that with these new requirements, they hadn't really thought about what data standards that they could leverage. So what's really nice to see is that ESMA are now looking to see how they can leverage data standards for the existing regulation. But really what I think needs to happen is that people need to engage at the business level with the data standards in their pockets when something new or something needs to be optimized. And better recognition of data standards when a new service is provided. And if the business or the regulator or the rule maker, like the European Commission, understands the benefit of the technical standards at the outset, then a lot of the challenges that we're facing today could have been addressed. And so I think it's really, really important that when we work globally, we try and engage the business or the regulator as early on as possible with these challenges.
That's great, Alex. And Jim, do you feel as though, as Alex mentioned, on the one hand, the regulators understand I know that our MEP speaker this morning referenced standards quite a bit in his talk this morning. Do you think regulators understand the importance of standards? And going back to Alex's point, do you think business is good at articulating the importance of standards?
I think they certainly understand the importance of it, and I think the point was well made that MiFID II was almost a kind of masterclass in how to enforce the usage of data standards to clean up transactional data, and then clearly highlighting the link between standing data, reference data, and transactional data. I think what we're seeing, though, is that's beginning to expose some gaps in the overall process, which I think we as an industry need to help fill. I think one of the examples being, if you look at something like the LEI standard, for example, it's an extremely sophisticated standard. A large organisation looks after it. It's very slick, but it depends on an agreement of a definition of legal entity, for example, which tends to vary by jurisdiction. It might not be pinned down particularly accurately. And certainly, in my experience, when we've had issues with transaction reporting and use of LEIs, it's because people weren't quite sure what their legal entity structure even was, or how to ask the question, or to whom to answer the question. So I think the standards bodies themselves, where they're not already doing so, have a bit of a duty of care in terms of not just administering the pure standard itself, making sure there aren't duplicate IDs, things like that, but also making sure they understand how to use them, and that there are any sort of dependent terms and definitions, legal entity, instrument, they've all got one, are extremely clearly articulated and agreed by a representation of the industry.
Richard, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, quite a number of the standards, and LEI is one of them that have been mentioned and are relevant for some of the reporting, are ISO standards. And I mean, there is those are developed censored by the industry because they are working groups to which people through their national standards bodies can join to input into those standards, and they're not static. So the LEI, for instance, has just been republished with some additional functionality as a new version of that standard. So they have a review process built in, so that problems around definitions, and also the way what the standard does, or the need to improve it, can be addressed by the review process that takes place in ISO, and that's mandatory every 5 years actually. But in fact, the CFI, which the Classification of Financial Instruments standard, actually that's been revised about 3 or 4 times in the last 2 years because of the need of regulation actually, and to bring that standard very quickly up to being something that actually does the job that people like ESMA wanted to do, and so they've been made a more granular on the derivatives piece particularly. So they can actually improve these standards more frequently than every 5 years, and that's an example of where they've been doing that. But there's also new standards coming through the process that will be relevant in the context of regulation as well, like the UTI, Unique Transaction Identifier, and the Unique Product Identifier as well, which is currently in process. And so there are bodies that include the industry that are working on this, and FIX plays a big part in this too. FIX actually works very closely with ISO now. There's usually FIX reps on most of the key ISO working groups, and part of FIX itself is actually becoming or going through the process of becoming an ISO standard. So there's an increasingly a harmonious relationship between ISO work and what FIX does. I think that's fantastic, because obviously FIX brings that unique global across asset class and across industry segment perspective, which very few organizations do.
I agree, Richard, and it's encouraging to hear not only that FIX is taking the lead in this, but there are signs of more and more cooperation. But there is still quite a long list of challenges globally. How do we prioritize? Alex, over to you. What, given the global challenges, what are the areas that we should tackle first, and how do we do it?
So again, I think. Really, it's about aligning the standards behind the business challenges. And I was interested to see over the last 2 years how more venues are looking to distribute data directly, for example.
Yeah.
And ridiculously, they're using 2 different standards, and even when they took a standard, they customized it beyond what was really necessary in order to suit the way that their systems worked, when instead of actually working with a standards body to go and drive the extension of the standard. And that was because the business wasn't engaged with the process of engaging with the standards. And, standard bodies can be accused of being a little bit slow. So when you want to be agile with a new data source, whether it's a real-time streaming service or whether it's a reference data service or something, is to make sure that the business is engaged, so that they are saying, well, in the future, we will want to go and do this, or we will want to go and do that. Let's push it through the standards body faster so we can support it. Because once you actually get the business using the standard and using the standard in the right way, then we can see that you get standardized adapters to absorb that data, and it becomes cheaper for the business in the long term anyway, and it's more likely to be adopted one way or the other. So engage the business again with the standards process.
How, and for my interest, how do standards organizations generally interface with the business, as you say, Alex? Is it reliant on organizations like FIX, or is it reliant on the biggest customer? And open to anyone who wants to chip in on that one.
Let me respond, but I'm going to point this very quickly to Geoffroy, because it's a classic example of where you've got somebody senior within an organization who understands the value of a standardization approach and then pulls it into their product. So Richard and Geoffroy are exactly the sort of people we want to get involved in the standards bodies to make sure that their organization, but a broader group gets involved. So when you run a reference data working group, or even a high performance data working group, is to make sure you've got the vendors involved or the trading venues involved buying into that process as it's constructed.
No, that's right. I think maybe I got a chance to see a bit both sides of the challenges, but I think when you start looking at new standards and whether it's a bit more global or not, but you always need to look at use cases, how it would work, and that's how we've been working. I think at FIX is understand the key requirement, but let's look at how it would work, and how the implementation would work. So I think it's very important to look at it from a pragmatic viewpoint as well, but also think about how in the future is it possible to make sure that it's future proof? So I think it's being very pragmatic, but fully agree with Alex that we need to have the business involved, and so I know it's not always easy to find the time and the resource to do it, but in the long term that's so valuable.
And I think it's we're in danger, and this has probably been the problem in the past, a long series of sort of bilateral engagements between customers and standards organizations, and I suppose we're in the game of trying to minimize those bilateral engagements and just consolidating as much as we can. And to that point, if I can, to you, Jim, the number of standards organizations has got to be an issue, hasn't it? Or do you think harmony is eventually achievable there?
I think having multiple organisations look after standards that are in effect competing with each other for the same space is definitely a problem. There's no real advantage to that. I mean, you can argue that you get some sort of a greater disparity of thought, and perhaps you drive out a better solution in the end. But getting there is painful, and by the time people have adopted multiple things, they tend to stick with them. So there's very little good that comes out of that. And in fairness, I think where we've seen that happen in the past, it has been a regional split or an asset class split, or there's been felt to be some kind of level of segregation. Perhaps people never thought that these things may end up coming together in perhaps the manner that they ultimately have done. And to that end, we found that there's much more coordination now. Again, back to the LEI, it's a global initiative. It took a multi-government government organisation to kick it off, but it got there, and we only have one of them, which is very good. I think the ISIN standard is another example. Things like MIX is another example. So, and this is where bodies like ISO are very effective. Regardless of whether we like the way they work or not, and they obviously work pretty well. The key point is the IBIS. They're international, and you tend to only get one of them. I think one thing that's probably worth noting on the adoption of standards, picking up on something Alex said as well, though, is that the resistance, if you like, to creating standards or using them is a multifaceted problem. And there are all sorts of extremely good reasons why people often go their own way. I think we've seen this many times with the usage of FIX itself and the development of FIX. It's partly because people don't know who to talk to. It's partly because people might not even know there is a standard. It might be because the standards process, if you like, is too slow. And I think Alex made a good point there. The solution to that, I mean, you can put a broad banner of education on a lot of it. I think there probably is a role for some kind of clearinghouse of experts, if you like, where to go to with particular problems. I like the FIX reference data working group because I kind of see it fulfilling that role. Of course, if people know who the FIX working group are, which is a start. But the point is, you don't have to know who the ISO MIC user group people are. You don't have to know how to get in a whole leaf. These people must be able to help you do that. And I think that's going to be critical. And one thing which I think FIX has done a very good job of, and at the risk of slightly felling FIX organisation, but hey, it's a FIX conference, I'm allowed to, that I think it's done that. And we have acted as a bit of a gatekeeper to other people, as well as our own standards. And I think we should keep that going. It's very important.
That's very clear, Jim. Thank you. Richard, anything else to add on that? I quite like Jim's idea of a clearinghouse, if you like, for sort of being a funnel for all these different conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think we try to do that because many of us are members of some of these bodies. I mean, I'm involved in the ISO work on a number of these standards through the UK Financial Services ISO committee, which is called IST 12 for some reason, which I currently chair. So we can funnel questions about how some of the ISO standards work through directly to ISO and some of the working groups, and very happy to do that. I just had a sort of general point on standards though, because I mean the reality is that not just on reference data but across the board, a lot of standards kind of have grown out of actually proprietary systems, and I think that point was made on terms of some of the data feeds. And as some of those proprietary standards got more widely used, they became virtual market standards by almost by default. I don't think there's actually a lot of global open standards bodies that we have to worry about. I mean, obviously we've got ISO, and that does a lot of the work. Obviously we've got FIX, we've got some specialized ones like the Object Management Group, but I don't think that there's a plethora of them, and most of them do try, and I think we're seeing that now with ISO and FIX, to make things work together where that makes sense. Obviously, each firm has to make its own decisions as to which standards work well operationally for them, and if they can interoperate with other standards that are needed externally, which often they can, then that's fine. Obviously, we want to make things work and work optimally between firms and also within firms as well. And there may be different standards tools that people can adopt that to achieve that objective. And some standards, and I mean the FIGI is one which I'm associated with, often Bloomberg, have gone from being proprietary to open, so anyone can use them whether or not they're using Bloomberg or not. So there are also things that move that way as well. And I think one of the key things around standards is access to them where they are particularly pervasive between organizations, and particularly where they are regulatory mandated. It's important that access to those standards is open, is transparent. The governance is people can see how that works, and that there aren't prohibitive costs involved in actually using the standards or redistributing data using those standards. And again, that's where FIX obviously plays a great role in making things work and being truly open in terms of what it delivers.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I might just mention something from the buy side perspective. Dealing with standards and data onboarding is a challenge, as it is for the sell side, and I guess our challenge is we divide into three. As always, costs is always pretty much close to the top. We also spend a lot of time on licensing, making sure that we are always respecting the license. It does take time to make sure that we're using those standards and those data sets in the correct way. But I thought it'd be also useful to mention, the challenges that we face practically when we're onboarding new sets of data. And I think this is going to be really important when we start, as many firms already have, consuming many more data sets relating to ESG. When you buy and try and onboard new data sets, it's not just a question of just dropping a flat file onto a SQL database somewhere. You have to make sure that these new data sets link with your security master, and I'm sure that sell side firms, buy side firms all have a security master, which as time goes by gets more and more complicated, because you've got to add on different identifiers to make sure, almost in many cases, that you've got every single possible type of identifier that you've got with each security. And if you don't have that, and if you are adding a new data set, it's very difficult to then make that set of data talk to or work with, your list of trades or your list of positions or your universe of instruments that you're looking at. So it's vitally important, as we keep on adding data sets and we keep buying them, that we're not spending literally weeks of developers' time trying to map new data sets to existing lists of securities or even issuers. And this is going to be a challenge within ESG. Jim, you've had thoughts on this, but for example, how, if we are looking at the carbon emissions by an issuer, are we sure that we're capturing the relevant information or linking the relevant information related to the equity in the same as we are for, let's say, the corporate bond? Very often within these standards, you can't link the two together. So I think that was the point I was going to make really there, is the importance of standards when we're buying new data sets. Does each vendor of data understand the challenges that we have to make those data points link with our existing ones? Jim, is that something that you've come across as well?
Yeah, I think probably a couple of things. I mean, one is that, in interest of disclosure, I actually used to work in a static data team in an earlier life, and it sort of called to mind how much money the industry spends and how many people it employs, basically to clean up vendor static data and to add data that the vendors don't supply. And I'm not criticizing the vendors here. This is data the vendors simply don't have. For example, the relationships between entities, the relationships between instruments, relationships between issuers, relationships between instruments and issuers. The list goes on and on. So, most major buy and sell side firms will have an army of some size, basically trying to piece all that together, and no doubt coming up with slightly different views of the world. That is really something which you'd like to see actually move, or should be moved into the data standards world. The question then is, well, who's going to do it, and who's going to pay for it? You'd like to think that it's a general optimization for the industry, and people would probably not mind paying a larger fee if they can have a smaller headcount. But no one's done the economic analysis on that yet. I mean, it's a big thing, and I don't even know if we'd know where to start. But to me, that would be something we really need to address to come up with a far more consistent view of the world across the industry sets and to evolve our data faster.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. And that leads into my next question. Over to you, Geoffroy, and maybe you can expand on this, but I understand that over the past year, the communities worked together to create a paper, which we mentioned at the top, identifying the primary sources of data and how we can reduce the complexities of numerous data points. Can you tell us more about this, about the paper, and where can we get a copy?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I must say that, actually, Philippe Perrault and Huey, who knew it, start the process some time ago and did a fantastic job to really put together the first version of this paper. And now at Fix, we're looking after, this document. But basically, this document really aims at identifying what we could call the primary source of the data, or the authoritative source of data. And that's basically, it's a recommended practice document, to be fair. So, but it's basically, where you can find the primary sources to ensure that, I guess all the industry is using the same sources. And some example would be ISO, Glyph, or ANA. But it's really to make sure that, we don't start using multiple sources for at least certain type of data where we believe there should be only one primary source. And I think it can definitely resolve a lot of issues from a reconciliation viewpoint. When I mentioned earlier in the call that, we all use thirds and only one, the venue would report information, but then if the source is coming from the same place, then definitely it would definitely help with the process. So I think that this paper is really a living document, as I mentioned, but it gives a very good starting point for all of us, for the industry. So Fix will continue to maintain that document. So we had a few sessions, a few months ago, and definitely we'll continue to get the feedback, and as we have more standards, more sources of information, we'll maintain that document. But I think this document is available. It should be available with the pack. But any if anyone would like to get access to it, I'm sure that we can provide you with a copy fairly easily.
Brilliant. We've got a question from the floor, if I may. What's your question?
This is actually Tom Jordan. I work with the Fixed Program Office, and just earlier this week, they wrote FINRA just put out a regulation, that's a U.S. regulator, on trace reporting. So for fixed income, for corporates and governments, they're asking for new information. So Fix sent a note to them saying, that's fine, we'll work with you. And they came back and said, oh, we'd love to work with you. So that's an example of upfront, we're going to be working with them, and I think that will work out fine. But we have a lot of situations that are in place now, right? And, all the exchanges do things differently. Market data vendors do things differently. Do we sort of give up on that and just focus on the new initiatives and just hope we can make some impact there? Or some of the stuff that's in place that's already developed, I mean, do we have any chance of changing that, or is that just unrealistic?
That's a great question. Alex, far away, yeah.
I'd like to start off on this one, because I think protocols evolve, and there gets to a stage where an existing feed basically becomes incapable of efficiently communicating anymore. And I think you go and see firms realizing that their proprietary interface is difficult to maintain, It's difficult for firms to consume. And I'd actually point back to an initiative that was done by the fixed trading community at the beginning of the decade, when there was a big initiative to persuade a lot of trading venues within the fixed income space to leave behind their proprietary protocols and adopt a standard in order to, number one, allow more competition to happen in the market, and number two, to reduce the cost of maintaining gateways. So a lot of fixed income trading venues, and principally it started off with the CEFs, which were obviously new venues, adopted the new fixed protocol, but then the cash trading interfaces, which were legacy, old proprietary, were switched across to fixed, and has actually allowed the industry to start to transform as a result of it. So actually, I think it's really important that we push the standards for and go after the traditional interfaces that have existed, to show that there is a business benefit. I know I keep on banging on about this, but there is a business benefit to switching to standards as well as a technical one.
That's great. Thank you. We're just got a few minutes left. Just remember, if you do have any questions, just use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom. Just hover over the bottom. You can add one there. But very quickly, why don't we just have a quick 30 seconds each on what should be the priorities for the fixed community in 2021 in this regard. And you've got 30 seconds. Geoffroy, away you go. What do you think should be the priorities of the fixed community?
Yeah, and I will also take a little bit my business hat, and also I'm going to just throw the B word, but Brexit, obviously. I mean, I think we could see that there will be some divergence in regulation, across the UK and Europe, and again that means that there will be different type of requirements. So I think as a community and as fixed, we need to push for standardization, and we need to be part of any consultation and as early as possible. So that's definitely something that is key. We need to speak as one voice, as an industry, wherever we are located, and I think fix is the right conduit to be able to do that, and really to be as ahead of the game as possible to to influence the regulation and the standardization, to reach at the end of the day a business goal, which is obviously to have standards, but at a cost-effective way.
Jim, 30 seconds from you on the priorities for the fixed community in 21.
I think partly education, and that document that the gentleman was referring to, I think it's definitely a key part of that. I think getting that out to the industry as a whole is absolutely key, so everyone understands what we are. And I think also using that as a two-way process and soliciting feedback, and this is the clearinghouse idea, effectively saying, well, okay, now we've told you what the world looks like, you need to come back and tell us whether that's the world you actually need. If it isn't, what are we going to do about it? And actually act as that kind of gatekeeper.
So education and promote ourselves more as a gatekeeper. I like that. Let's go Richard, then Alex, if that's okay. Then that's a bit fairer. Richard, then Alex.
Well, I think continuing to engage with the regulators. We had a good meeting with ESMA, just a fixed meeting just about a week or so ago, and we're hoping to keep that going across a whole range of issues, but obviously data was one of those issues. So that's important, particularly as regulation continues to evolve, and we're seeing that not just in Europe but elsewhere. And then specifically, I know there's a work stream around this, but on the ESG side, and you mentioned it, James, that is, and I know from my own personal experience, that is a huge data challenge, a whole new source of data, which we're having to grapple with. And there are things like taxonomies, use the T word, which are emerging, which people are going to have to get to grips with and work out what they mean in the context of their business and their obligations. So FIX can play a big role with that as well. Great.
And finally, Alex, wrap us up if you can with our
something completely different. I mean, I saw the high performance working group did some really, really great, fantastic work on actually defining a very, very efficient protocol for trading. I think they should finish off their work on market data. I think given that Now there's a plethora of new real-time data sources and people updating their feeds now as well. And I know you've got it in for real time on this session, but I'm going to stand up and say we need to have enhancements to the real-time market data protocol, especially in the context of high performance.
Brilliant. Laying down the gauntlet there, Alex. I like that. Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, we've come to the end of our session. It's been brilliant, guys. Thank you so much. Some really good ideas and some initiatives for us to follow this year and next. As I mentioned at the beginning, please stick around for the rest of the sessions. Visit the virtual conference site as well. And with that, can I say a big thank you, first of all, to Geoffroy, to Alex, to Richard, to Jim, and to all of those who've taken the time to join us today. I'm going to hand over to Deb, and I wish you a good afternoon and a great weekend. Thanks very much for tuning in.
Thank you, and thanks for joining the session. A recording of this session will be available from next Thursday on the platform for 30 days after the event. The next session in Stream 1 is Untangling the European Consolidated Tape for Equities, and Stream 2 is FX Technical Challenges and Regulatory Demands. Finally, just a reminder to take a look at our sponsors booth in the virtual exhibit hall and network with other attendees in the networking lounge. Don't forget to join the live demos, and you can find an agenda in the information desk. And we have a competition running for those who visit all of the sponsor booths in the exhibit hall, and they'll go into a draw to win a prize. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.